It started innocently, or at least that's what I told myself at the time. The office was always a place where deadlines loomed, coffee cups never seemed full enough, and the sound of keyboards clicking created this constant, busy hum in the background. In the middle of all that monotony, he stood out, not because he was the most handsome man in the room, but because he had this energy, this way of making even the most stressful meetings feel like a casual chat. I noticed him before I admitted it to myself. Maybe it was the way he would glance at me when someone cracked a joke in the break room, or the small nod he gave when we both disagreed silently with the boss's latest ridiculous idea. Those little, almost invisible interactions began to feel like a secret language only we spoke. It was harmless, I kept insisting. Everyone in the office had that one coworker they clicked with better than the rest. We were just comfortable around each other, at least. That's how it started. I'd find myself looking forward to days when I knew we'd be working on the same project, catching myself scanning the morning meeting to see if he'd show up. When he wasn't there, the day felt a little dimmer, the air heavier. I didn't even realize how much space he was taking up in my head until I caught myself checking my email more often, just in case he'd sent me something. The first time we really talked outside of work matters was during a late night at the office. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, the hallways were empty, and the hum of the air conditioning seemed louder than usual. I was struggling with a report that was due the next morning, and he walked by, holding his jacket, clearly ready to leave. But instead of going, he stopped by my desk and asked, "You good?" in this casual, genuine way that made my exhaustion spill out. I joked about quitting, and he laughed, not the polite kind of laugh people give out of obligation, but the deep, unguarded kind that made me want to keep talking. We ended up staying there for another hour, not just working, but sharing stories about our lives. That was the beginning of it. Our conversations became less about the job and more about everything else. We'd talk about music, about the weirdest food we'd ever tried, about the shows we pretended not to watch, but secretly loved. I learned he hated mornings, but loved the quiet of a late-night drive. He learned I couldn't stand the smell of cinnamon, but could eat chocolate at any time of the day. These were small, harmless facts, but they began to feel intimate, like pieces of a puzzle we were building together in secret. Little things started changing after that. He'd bring me coffee the way I liked it, without me ever asking. I'd save him the last slice of cake from the office birthday celebrations. When meetings ended, we lingered just a moment longer than necessary, as if parting too quickly would break something fragile between us. The air around us seemed charged, like there was something unspoken hanging in every glance, every laugh, every moment we spent together. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. People flirt at work all the time, right? It didn't mean anything. I was married, and I loved my husband. This was just a fun, harmless connection, something to make the long hours a little easier. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. Every time he walked into the room, I felt my heart jump just a little faster. Every text from him, even about something mundane, made me smile in a way I couldn't explain. The first time our hands brushed accidentally, it was like touching a live wire. I felt the heat rise in my face, and I saw something flicker in his eyes, something that told me he felt it too. We didn't acknowledge it out loud, but from that moment on, there was a shift. We started finding more reasons to be around each other, to work on the same tasks, to sit together during team lunches. Even when other people were around, it felt like there was this invisible thread tying us together, pulling us closer. I justified it all in my head. I wasn't doing anything wrong, not really. But late at night, lying in bed next to my husband, I'd find myself replaying conversations with him in my mind instead of thinking about my own marriage. It was thrilling in a way I hadn't felt in years, dangerous, but addictive. I told myself I could handle it, that it would stay just this, playful, innocent, contained within the walls of the office. But even then, I think I knew that once you start craving someone's presence this much, harmless stops being harmless very quickly. It happened so quickly, I almost didn't have time to process it. One day, we were exchanging our usual easy smiles across the office, sharing quiet moments in the break room, and the next, there was this sudden, cold distance I couldn't explain. It started subtly. He stopped lingering by my desk in the mornings, stopped sending me those little messages that had become part of my day. At first, I told myself he was just busy. Everyone has weeks when work piles up and social moments take a backseat. But then the silences stretched longer, and the spaces between our conversations grew until they felt like a canyon I couldn't cross. The moment it truly sank in was during a meeting. I made a light comment, the kind he usually would have smirked at or added onto, but he didn't even look up from his notes. It was like I wasn't there. I felt this strange, sharp pang in my chest, confusion, rejection, something I didn't want to name. The man who used to notice everything about me now seemed to look right through me. A few days later, I tried to break the ice. I passed by his desk, coffee in hand, using it as an excuse to stop and chat. "Hey, haven't seen you around much," I said with what I hoped was a casual tone. He glanced up briefly, smiled in a polite but distant way, and replied, "Yeah, been busy." Then he turned back to his screen. That was it. No follow-up, no warm undertone, nothing. The conversation was over before it even began, and the message was clear. It was disorienting. I kept replaying everything in my head, trying to pinpoint the moment things had shifted. Had I said something wrong? Had someone in the office noticed and made a comment to him? Or had he just decided I wasn't worth the trouble anymore? The more I thought about it, the more I realized there wasn't a single obvious reason. It was as if he'd flipped a switch and whatever connection we'd shared was gone. The real blow came when I overheard him talking to another coworker. They were laughing, really laughing, in that same easy way we used to. I felt my stomach knot up, an irrational mix of jealousy and humiliation flooding through me. It wasn't that he was laughing with someone else. It was that he was capable of giving that warmth to other people, just not to me anymore. I was no longer part of his inner circle, and the absence felt like a weight pressing on my chest. From then on, I noticed how he avoided opportunities to be alone with me. If we were assigned to the same task, he'd keep the interaction strictly professional, no side comments, no knowing glances. During lunch breaks, he'd sit with different groups, never near me. It was as though we'd never had those late-night talks, those shared jokes, those moments where the world seemed to narrow down to just us. It's strange how quickly something that once felt essential can become completely absent. I went from anticipating seeing him every day to dreading the awkwardness of our encounters. Even passing him in the hallway became a small ordeal. I'd catch his eye for the briefest moment before he'd look away, leaving me with this sinking, hollow feeling. There was no confrontation, no explanation. Just absence. A quiet withdrawal that felt sharper than any fight could have. I tried to tell myself it didn't matter, that it was better this way, that I could now focus fully on my marriage without this distraction. But the truth was I missed him. I missed the way he made me feel seen, understood, even special in a small, secret way. And more than anything, I hated that I didn't understand why it had ended. The office felt different after that. The same fluorescent lights, the same routine, but the energy had shifted. My days felt longer, my coffee tasted more bitter, and every time I glanced toward his desk, I felt that dull ache in my chest. It was like losing something you didn't even realize had become a part of your life until it was gone. And in the quiet moments, when I was honest with myself, I knew that this abrupt, cold ending wasn't just about him. It was about the emptiness it left behind and the dangerous truth that maybe, just maybe, I'd grown too attached to something I was never supposed to have in the first place. It was a Tuesday evening when everything unraveled. My husband had been quiet all day, the kind of quiet that hums with a strange, invisible tension. I thought maybe he'd had a stressful day at work, but the look in his eyes told me it was something heavier, something aimed directly at me. He didn't come to greet me when I got home, didn't ask about my day. Instead, he sat at the kitchen table with his phone in his hand, his expression unreadable. I remember setting my bag down, the sound of the zipper loud in the stillness, and asking him if everything was okay. He didn't answer at first, just looked at me with this mixture of disbelief and hurt that made my stomach twist. Then he asked, flatly, "Who is he?" My heart stopped. I didn't need him to clarify. I didn't need to ask what he meant. In that split second, my mind flashed through every moment at the office, the smiles, the late-night conversations, the texts. My mouth went dry, and all I could manage was, "What are you talking about?" But my voice cracked in a way that betrayed me. He didn't raise his voice, but the way he spoke was worse than yelling. He told me he'd seen the messages, not all of them, but enough to understand there was something there I hadn't told him about. He said my tone with this person was different, my words too familiar, too warm, too much like the way I used to talk to him when we first fell in love. I tried to explain, fumbling over my words, insisting that it was just a work friendship, that I had never crossed a physical line. But the more I spoke, the more I could see him shutting down. It wasn't about physical boundaries for him, it was about trust. About the fact that I had given a part of myself, an emotional intimacy, to someone else. That was something he couldn't ignore. His face was tight, his jaw clenched, but his eyes, they were the worst part. They were filled with this raw pain that made me feel like I was the one who had been punched. He asked me how long it had been going on, and when I hesitated, because I didn't know how to define it anymore, he let out this bitter laugh, the kind that's more of an exhale than an actual laugh. That sound cut through me. I kept trying to reach for his hand, but he kept his arms crossed, his body turned slightly away from me. He said he couldn't understand how I could let something like this grow between me and another man without ever thinking about what it would do to us. He said he'd always trusted me completely, and now he wasn't sure he even knew who I was. His words hit harder than I expected, because in that moment, I wasn't sure I knew who I was either. The rest of the night was a blur of half-arguments and heavy silences. I kept trying to explain, but everything I said sounded hollow, even to my own ears. I told him I loved him, that I'd never stopped loving him, but love didn't seem to be the issue anymore. It was respect. It was loyalty. It was the quiet understanding that had always existed between us, now cracked and broken. At one point, he asked me if I would be okay if the situation were reversed, if he'd been the one sharing his thoughts, his laughter, his little pieces of himself with another woman behind my back. The answer was obvious, and it made my chest tighten in shame. I wouldn't have been okay. I would have felt betrayed. And yet, here I was, asking him to see my actions in a softer light than I'd ever have given him. He didn't yell, didn't storm out. Instead, he went to the living room, sat on the couch, and turned on the TV without looking at me. The sound filled the space, but it wasn't comforting, it was just noise, a wall between us. I stood there in the kitchen for a long time, staring at him from the doorway, wanting to go to him but knowing he didn't want me near. That night, we slept in the same bed but felt miles apart. His body was turned away from me, his breathing steady but distant, and I lay there staring at the ceiling, wondering how something that had felt so harmless at first had led us to this point. Every memory of my work fling now felt tainted, every smile and text replaying in my head like evidence in a trial I had already lost. I didn't know how much he had seen, how deep his hurt went, or if there was any way to fix it. All I knew was that his discovery had changed something fundamental between us, something that might never go back to the way it was. The silence between us was the kind that didn't just fill a room, it pressed against your chest, made every breath feel heavier. At first, I thought it would pass, that maybe after a few days he'd cool off and we'd talk like we used to. But instead, the quiet settled in like an uninvited guest that had no intention of leaving. We went through the motions of daily life, eating dinner, watching TV, lying in bed, but it was like living with a stranger who happened to share the same address. His words, when they came, were short and practical, stripped of any warmth. "Pass the salt. Did you pay the bill? Your phone's ringing." That was all. No, how was your day? No casual laughter, no small talk about the weather or the neighbor's latest drama. Just nothing. The absence of conversation wasn't just about the lack of words, it was about what those missing words meant. Before, even if we'd had a bad day, we'd still end up sharing something, even if it was just a complaint about traffic or a funny video we'd seen. Now, those small exchanges were gone. The nights felt longer, the house quieter in a way that didn't feel peaceful. Sometimes I'd catch him scrolling on his phone, his face lit by the screen, and I'd wonder if he was talking to someone, anyone, just so he wouldn't have to talk to me. The silence bled into everything. Meals became an exercise in pretending not to notice how carefully we avoided eye contact. Sitting on the couch, We'd both be staring at the TV, but I couldn't tell you what we watched because my mind was too busy replaying all the conversations we weren't having. Even our mornings, which used to be filled with sleepy chatter and inside jokes, became a quiet shuffle from the bedroom to the kitchen to the front door. What made it worse was the way he seemed to be building walls without actually saying so. If I tried to bring up something lighthearted, he'd give a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes and then retreat back into whatever he was doing. If I asked a direct question about how he was feeling, he'd shrug or say, "I don't know," and that would be the end of it. It was like trying to talk to someone underwater. Everything was muffled, distant, impossible to reach. In the beginning, I thought maybe he needed space, that pushing too hard would only make him pull further away. But the longer the silence lasted, the more it started to feel permanent. I began to measure my days not by what happened, but by how many times we actually spoke. Some days, it was 3 or 4 sentences. Other days, maybe 1. I didn't know which was worse, the days when we didn't speak at all, or the days when the few words we did exchange were loaded with unspoken tension. It wasn't just the silence itself that hurt, it was the absence of the man I knew. I missed his teasing, the way he'd make up ridiculous scenarios to make me laugh. I missed the way he used to reach for my hand absent-mindedly while walking through a store. I missed his voice in the morning, raspy and warm, telling me to hit snooze one more time. Now, all of that was gone, replaced with an emotional void I didn't know how to fill. The silence made me question everything, not just about our marriage, but about myself. Had I been fooling myself into thinking we were unshakable? Had I underestimated how fragile trust could be? Sometimes I'd start to say something, just to break the tension, and the words would die in my throat because I didn't know if I'd be met with indifference or another empty nod. Nights became the hardest. Lying next to him in the dark, I could feel the physical space between us like a canyon. We used to fall asleep tangled together. Now we might as well have been sleeping in different beds. I'd listen to his breathing, wondering if he was awake, wondering if he was thinking about me, about us, or if he was already imagining a life without me in it. Even in public, the change was obvious. Friends would invite us out, and he'd be polite, even charming, but the moment we were alone again, the wall would go back up. It was as if he decided that whatever connection we'd once had was no longer worth tending to, and I was left trying to water a garden that no longer had any roots. The worst part was realizing that this silence wasn't just punishment, it was a sign. A sign that something in him had shifted so completely that words couldn't fix it. And as much as I wanted to believe we could still find our way back, each quiet day made that hope feel smaller, dimmer, harder to hold on to. It was during one of our rare, clipped conversations that he said it, not angrily, not even dramatically, but in a calm, matter-of-fact tone that somehow made it hurt even more. He told me he didn't believe in monogamy anymore. At first, I thought I'd misheard him. We'd been together for years, built a marriage on the foundation of commitment and exclusivity, and now here he was, telling me that he no longer thought it made sense. I tried to laugh it off, thinking maybe he was saying it just to get a reaction out of me, but the look on his face told me he was completely serious. His eyes were steady, his voice was even, and there was no hesitation in the way he said it. I asked him what he meant, hoping that maybe he was talking in abstract, philosophical terms, the way some people debate over dinner about love and relationships. But he wasn't theorizing, he was talking about us, about our marriage. He said he'd been thinking about it for a while, that maybe people weren't meant to be with just one person forever, that the idea of one partner for life was unnatural and outdated. It felt like the ground shifted beneath me, like the home I thought I knew had suddenly been built on sand. I tried to argue, to remind him of what we had, of the promises we made on our wedding day, of the years we'd spent choosing each other over and over again. But he just shook his head, as if I was missing the point. He said it wasn't about not caring for me, it was about his own view of relationships changing. He insisted that monogamy wasn't realistic for most people, and that maybe it had never been realistic for us. Hearing those words from him made my chest tighten in a way I can't fully describe. It wasn't just that he was questioning our relationship, it was that he was rewriting the rules we'd built it on, and he hadn't even asked me if I wanted to play by those new rules. It was like he'd been living with these thoughts for weeks, maybe months, and I was only just now being let in on them. I couldn't stop thinking about how long he'd felt this way and what that meant for us. I wanted to believe this was just the pain talking, that his anger and hurt over what had happened with my work fling was making him lash out, but the calmness in his voice suggested otherwise. It was as though he had genuinely decided that commitment in the way we'd always defined it was no longer something he valued. And if he didn't value it, then where did that leave me? I kept thinking about all the small moments we'd shared over the years, the little traditions we had, the private jokes, the way we used to talk about growing old together. All of that had been built on the belief that we belonged only to each other. Without that belief, what were we? Just two people sharing a house, bound by legal paperwork and a history that suddenly felt fragile. His words opened a door in my mind that I didn't want to walk through. I began imagining what his version of a non-monogamous life might look like, seeing other people, dating, forming connections with someone else while still living under the same roof as me. The thought made me feel physically sick, but he didn't seem shaken by it at all. If anything, he seemed oddly at peace, as though he'd finally said something he'd been holding back for far too long. I asked him if this meant he'd already been with someone else, if this sudden rejection of monogamy was his way of preparing me for something I didn't know yet. He didn't answer directly, just said that it wasn't about anyone specific, it was about him and his own beliefs changing. But that non-answer sat heavy in my chest, because it left room for doubt, and doubt is a poison that spreads quickly. I found myself wondering if this was his way of punishing me, taking away the security of exclusivity because I'd given a part of myself to someone else, even if it wasn't physical. Or maybe this was his way of freeing himself from the rules that he felt I had already broken. Either way, the message was the same. He no longer saw our marriage as the unshakable, monogamous bond it had once been. From that point on, every interaction we had was colored by those words. I couldn't look at him without thinking about what he'd said, without wondering if he was imagining a life where we were no longer each other's only person. Even the most ordinary moments, making dinner, folding laundry, were tinged with this new, unspoken reality that nothing about us was the same anymore. The idea of us had been replaced with something unfamiliar, something I didn't recognize, and something I wasn't sure I could ever accept. I didn't realize how much energy it would take just to keep my marriage from collapsing completely. Every day felt like I was balancing on a tightrope, trying to steady myself while the wind of his indifference kept pushing me off balance. I threw myself into every possible effort to hold on, small gestures, big apologies, anything that might remind him of what we once had. I cooked his favorite meals even when I didn't feel like eating myself. I wrote him notes, short messages left on the kitchen counter or slipped into his laptop bag, hoping he'd read them during the day and think of me with something other than resentment. I even started avoiding certain coworkers just so he wouldn't have any reason to think I was still tangled up in the mess that started all this. But nothing seemed to pierce the wall he had built. Sometimes, I'd get a flicker of hope, like when he'd respond to a text with more than one sentence, or when he'd sit next to me on the couch without putting physical distance between us, but those moments would fade as quickly as they came. Most days, it felt like I was the only one fighting, and he was just standing there, watching me wear myself down. I tried to get him to talk, to open up about what he was feeling, even if it was anger. I told him I'd rather hear his rage than this silence that was swallowing us whole. But every time I pushed, he'd shut down more. He'd say, "I don't know what to say," or "it doesn't matter anymore," and those words scared me more than yelling ever could. Because when someone says it doesn't matter anymore, it's usually because they've already stopped caring. Nights became the loneliest. I'd lie awake next to him, listening to the rhythm of his breathing, wondering if he was pretending to be asleep just so he wouldn't have to talk to me. I'd replay every conversation we'd had since the fallout, searching for signs that we were making progress, but all I could find were gaps, moments where I'd tried to connect and he'd turned away. It was exhausting, this constant reaching for someone who didn't reach back. I even considered counseling, something I never thought we'd need. I researched therapists, read reviews, and printed out a list of options. When I handed it to him, he barely glanced at it before saying, "If you want to go, you can. I'm fine." The dismissal stung, because it told me that he didn't see our marriage as a we problem anymore. It was just me, struggling to fix something he had already stepped away from. My friends noticed the change in me. I stopped going out as much, stopped answering calls when I didn't have the energy to pretend everything was okay. They'd ask if things were better, and I'd smile and say, "We're working on it," even though I wasn't sure if that was true. Deep down, I was afraid to admit how bad it had gotten, because saying it out loud would make it real in a way I wasn't ready to face. The hardest part was the emotional whiplash. There were moments when he'd soften, when he'd ask if I wanted a cup of tea or remind me to take my jacket because it was cold outside. Those small acts would give me a spark of hope, make me think maybe he was coming back to me. But then the next day, he'd be distant again, retreating into himself, and I'd be left feeling foolish for believing things might be turning around. I started to question not just the marriage, but myself. Was I trying to save us because I truly believed in what we had, or was I just afraid of letting go? Was I holding on to him, or was I holding on to the version of him that existed before everything fell apart? The more I thought about it, the more I realized I wasn't sure which answer scared me more. Even when I felt like I was running out of strength, I kept pushing forward. I'd remind myself of the life we'd built together, the years of shared history, the countless moments that had made us more than just two people in a relationship. But I also knew that love alone might not be enough anymore. Every day was a balancing act between hope and exhaustion, between believing we could still make it and wondering if I was the only one left who wanted to try. One